Mahaban. We're now moving on to the fourth of our talks. There are 12 in all, and we're looking at the second of the three Cappadocian Fathers. We've looked at Basil, who was the senior one in many ways, and now we're looking at his close contemporary, Gregory of Nazianzus. We have to say about Gregory, although he brought enormous skill and style to his defense of the Holy Trinity, that he was a very different character to Basil. Basil was forceful and energetic. Gregory was much more uncertain and self-doubting. Basil was a commanding person who commanded attention. Gregory did so, but much more by his writing than by his physical presence with people. Basil gave himself up into public service, which he did in an extraordinary way in Caesarea, particularly with the hospice he established. Gregory preferred retreat in the end, rather than leading a varied and sometimes difficult group of people, and particularly bishops. Gregory was fussy, or we'd say fastidious. He was a craftsman when it came to words, but he had deep-seated and passionate theological convictions. So he was a different character to Basil, and it reminds us that there are many different characters in God's church seeking to establish his kingdom. He was born in 329 or 330, exactly the same time more or less as Basil, and he came from a town a little further south in Cappadocia called Arianzus, which was near to Nazianzus, which is where he and his father worked for most of their lives. It was southwest Cappadocia. His father was the bishop of Nazianzus. His sister was a woman called Gorgonia, and he had a brother who was very eminent, a physician to the emperor at the court of the emperor in Nicomedia. His education was lengthy. He was tutored by a man called Bishop Amphilochus, the elder, who came from the Konya area of Turkey. He went to further education at Caesarea Maritima on the coast of Palestine, where Origen had taught some years before. He then went from there to Alexandria, just down the road from here, where he continued his education. He then took a ship which took him from Alexandria to Athens, during which there was a terrible storm. And during this storm, he offered his life in a fresh way to God for his purposes in the way that he lived his life thereafter. And he records that in a book which is the poem of his life, which I'll show you in just a moment. Then for 10 years, he was a student in Athens, from 348 AD to 358 AD, 10 whole years. And after that, at the age of 30, he returned from Athens to Cappadocia, and he sought out Basil, whom he'd met as a fellow student in Athens over a number of years when Basil was there with him. Probably in the region of 3 or 4 years they overlapped in Athens. He was taken then by Basil up into his retreat in his own estate up at Anicia on the Pontus, that is the coast of the Black Sea. And Gregory Nazianzus said to him in an ironic letter, said, "I admire your Pontic darkness." He didn't awfully like it as a place, but he admired Basil, and he admired Basil's own commitment to the philosophic or the ascetic life that he was displaying up there. In 361, there was a change of emperor. Julian the Apostate, no longer a Christian, the last pagan emperor, took charge for about 2 years. Then there was another change, and a man called Jovian became emperor for 8 months. And then another person became emperor in the east called Valens, who was to continue until 378, and who adopted not the Nicene position, but also the Arian position on the Holy Trinity, and made life difficult for the church, for Basil and for Gregory, as he had done that. In 360 AD, really when he was a little over 30 or thereabouts, he was ordained. He began to write. He wrote on the blessing of peace. He was forcibly ordained by his father, the Bishop of Nazianzus. And this, to Gregory, was an awful moment. He didn't want to be ordained. He fled up again to Pontus, where Basil was, and he wrote an oration in defense of his flight. He shrank from being a priest and a leader in the church. And from 362 to 372, he supported as best he could his father in the ministry at Nazianzus. He continued there for a while, but then Basil appointed him a bishop of a place that he disliked intensely, which was called Sassima. If there was time, I would read you a short extract about this, but he disliked the way in which Basil made him to become a bishop of a place which he hated very much indeed. He said it was an utterly dreadful, poky little hole. Nazianzus became depressed. He continued to write. He continued to stand up for the Nicene Creed. And then an amazing break came in his life, when in 379 AD he was summoned to Constantinople to preach on behalf of the Nicene party. It was the great moment of his life. He was asked to go to a chapel in Constantinople, which was run and owned by a Nicene Christian, and to preach the Nicene doctrine that the Father and the Son were of the same substance. He went up there in 379, and it was also a difficult period for him. He preached a number of orations that we can read on these subjects, on the role of a bishop, on Athanasius, on Cyprian, the leader of the church in North Africa, of Maximus, a man who came from Alexandria and who deceived him. And then principally he gave these 5 theological orations, which were on God the Father, 2 on the Son, 1 against one of the Arian leaders called Euonymus, and last of all 1 on the Holy Spirit. And it is for these orations that Gregory is principally known. He hoped to become the Bishop of Constantinople, but he was unable to lead the bishops who gathered there for a council under the leadership of the new emperor who just arrived, called Theodosius. Unable to lead the bishops, he then decided to withdraw. He was about to become the Bishop of Constantinople, but it never really fully happened. He went back to his home area, to Nazianzus, where his father had ministered for so many years. And there he remained for 10 years, writing up his orations for us, and principally those 5 theological orations, which we'll look at later, which explain the relationship of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. So he was a different character to Basil, but he brought a great style and insight and theological perception to the doctrine of the Trinity. Thank you. Shukran.